I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you're holding this physical stack of historical artifacts right in your hands.
Right, like sitting at a big wooden table.
Exactly. You are sitting at this large wooden table, and spread out right in front of you are these tactical military maps. And they're covered in these massive, sweeping
Oh, and
arrows.
those stark, just raw black and white photographs from the front lines.
Yeah, those two. Plus these highly detailed vehicle schematics. I mean, just looking at them, you can almost smell the diesel fuel, right? The cordite, the freezing mud.
You really can.
And together, this curated stack of visual evidence, it tells the story of the largest, most staggering, and absolutely just most destructive military campaign in human history. I'm talking about Adolf Hitler's 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa.
It's just a profoundly visceral way to engage with history, I think. You aren't just reading dates and casualty figures in some dry textbook.
No, not at all.
You are staring directly into the faces of the people who actually lived it. You're looking at the exact maps the generals used to orchestrate the whole thing.
The actual blueprints, too.
Right, the blueprints of the machines they built to fight it.
Yeah.
And, of course, the photographs of the horrific reality that just swallowed all of them.
And so that is our mission for this deep dive today. We are basing our entire analysis on this very specific collection of visual excerpts. They were curated directly from David M. Glantz's definitive book on the subject.
Which is an incredible resource, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. And we are going to guide you through these visual sources to strip away all those decades of myths that have, clouded the Eastern Front.
There are so many myths.
So many. By the end of our time today, you are going to understand exactly how a war that was planned on these neat, sweeping, just highly optimistic maps, how it descended into this unimaginable struggle.
A struggle against geography, mostly.
Yeah, geography, the elements, and sheer human endurance. We are going right past the clean historical narratives. We want to look at the gritty, horse-drawn, mud-soaked reality of how military technology and vast distances and total civilian mobilization all collided.
Well, before we can even begin to analyze the chaos of the actual battlefield, we kind of have to look at the starting line.
Right, the people who made it happen.
Exactly. We need to examine the architects of this clash and, frankly, the grand illusions they harbored. And the first pieces of evidence in our stack here are these three very specific portrait photographs.
I'm looking at them now.
The contrast in these opening images is just immediately striking. I mean, they tell you almost everything you need to know about the opposing leadership styles.
Yeah.
Right? And the fundamental philosophies driving millions of men to war.
Yeah, so looking at the first portrait right now, it's Adolf Hitler. But this is not the composed, statesman-like portrait you might expect from a national leader.
From it.
He is depicted in this state of impassioned, almost fanatical yelling. His head is tilted way back, his eyes are super wide, and his hands are raised up.
Contorted, almost.
Yeah, contorted in this highly theatrical, emotionally charged gesture. Honestly, it looks less like a military commander and more like a cult leader right in the middle of a trance.
Well, that is totally by design. What you are looking at there is the visual embodiment of ideological fervor over calculated reason.
Emotion over logic.
Exactly. Hitler's entire leadership model, and really the entire structure of the Nazi state, was built on this concept of escalating momentum. It completely relied on that belief in the triumph of the will,
Right, that sheer willpower could just win the day.
Yeah, the idea that sheer fanatical aggression and the supposed inherent superiority of the German fighting spirit could overcome any physical or numerical obstacle. The photographer is capturing that volcanic, unpredictable aggression right there.
Because that's what he wanted to project.
Because that's exactly what the German command structure was demanding of its soldiers on the ground.
Wow. And then you contrast that immediately with the portrait of Joseph Stalin, which is sitting right next to it in our stack. And it feels like hitting a brick wall.
A total brick wall.
Stalin's photograph is just the polar opposite. He is utterly stoic. He's wearing this very simple, rigid, military-style tunic with, minimal decoration.
Nothing flashy at all.
Right. But it's his face that really draws you in because his expression is completely unreadable. It is cold, it's heavy, and it gives away absolutely nothing.
Not a hint of emotion.
No emotion, no yelling, just this rigid, unyielding stare.
And that Stonewall persona aligns so perfectly with the political reality of the Soviet Union at that exact moment. Where Hitler ruled through frenetic, escalating momentum and pitting factions against each other, Stalin ruled through total rigid control.
And fear, obviously.
Oh, absolutely.
A
Terrifyingly immovable bureaucracy. He was a man of the archives, right? Man of endless committees and purges.
You didn't need to yell.
Exactly. He didn't rely on impassioned speeches to motivate people. He relied on an all-encompassing system of state terror and absolute administrative dominance. So here you have the immovable object preparing to meet the unstoppable force.
But there is a third man in our source photos here, and he seems just entirely out of place between these two ideological titans.
His Franz Halder.
Yeah, Halder. Looking at his photograph, he looks like a high school math teacher. Or, I don't know, an accountant. He has these small, very precise, wire-rimmed spectacles, a severe, clipped haircut, and this tight-lipped, incredibly serious expression.
He really does look like an accountant.
He just does not look like a warrior.
Well, he represents the bridge between Hitler's fanaticism and the actual physical reality on the ground. Halder was the chief of staff of the German Army High Command.
The logistics guy.
He was the ultimate logistical planner. This is a man whose entire life was governed by slide rules, timetables, railway capacities, and logistics. It was literally his job to take Hitler's apocalyptic visions and translate them into reality on a piece of paper.
To make the math work.
Right. He had to figure out how to move over 3 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 750,000 horses across an entire continent.
Which brings us right to the first major piece of tactical evidence we have in the stack here. It's an operational map dated June 21st, 1941. So the very eve of the invasion.
Jumping off point.
Just holding this map, I mean, the sheer scale of what is being depicted is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. It shows the border between the German-controlled territories and the Soviet Union. And the front lines stretch from the Baltic Sea all the way in the extreme north, all the way down to the Black Sea in the south.
To put that into perspective for you, we are talking about a continuous front line that is roughly 1,800 miles long.
1,800 miles, that's insane.
It's an unprecedented scale for a single coordinated military operation. And on the Soviet side of that dotted borderline, the map shows massive, dense concentrations of forces.
Those big gray blobs.
Yeah, they're broken down into specific military districts. We see the Baltic Military District up in the north. Below that, the Special Western Military District, which is guarding the direct historical invasion route right to Moscow.
All right, in the center.
Then further south is the Special Kiev Military District in Ukraine, and finally the Odessa Military District. And like you said, these are represented on the map by these massive, heavy gray blobs indicating millions of defending soldiers.
And facing them, just coiled up like a spring on the western side of the border, you see the three massive German thrusts arrayed against them.
The three army groups.
Right. You have Army Group North aiming upward toward Leningrad. You have Army Group Center, which is this immense concentration of force aiming straight through the middle toward Minsk and Smolensk, effectively pointing a dagger right at Moscow.
The main effort.
And then Army Group South pushing down into the agricultural and industrial heartland of Ukraine. But what really stands out to me here are the arrows. Halder's arrows on this map are just incredibly neat.
Very precise.
They're clean, sweeping arcs pointing deep, deep into Soviet territory.
Well, those clean arrows represent a military doctrine built entirely on speed, deep penetration, and just the absolute pinnacle of operational confidence.
No hubris, really.
Yeah, Halder and the German general staff were looking at this map and seeing a problem of geometry and time. The doctrine, which would later be famously dubbed Blitzkrieg, was designed to slice right through those Soviet gray blobs.
Just bypass them.
Pierce them, encircle them, and destroy them before the Soviet High Command even understood what was happening. They expected to execute these lightning-fast encirclements and destroy the bulk of the Red Army right there near the border within a matter of weeks.
Before autumn even hit.
Exactly, well before autumn.
But, looking closely at this map, I just keep thinking about how dangerous a piece of paper can actually be for a military leader.
Oh, it's incredibly dangerous.
Because when you are sitting in a comfortable, well-lit war room back in Berlin, these neat little arrows drawn in colored pencil, they look so achievable. It's just an inch on a map, right?
Just a quick pencil stroke.
Right. So I have to wonder, did looking at these tidy, perfectly straight lines completely blind the German planners to the physical reality of what they were actually looking at? Did they just forget about the vast distances, the unpaved roads, and millions of people actually living between those lines?
The psychology of military planning often falls into exactly that trap. A map is, by its very definition, an abstraction of reality.
Right, it simplifies things.
It flattens impenetrable forests into just light green shading. It smooths out deeply rutted, unpaved roads into solid black lines. And it completely removes the human element from the equation.
The people who actually have to walk that distance.
Exactly. And you have to remember, the German high command was heavily fueled by their rapid, almost unbelievable victories in France and Poland in the preceding years.
They were riding high.
Very high. They look at this map of the Soviet Union and essentially superimpose their previous experiences right onto it. They assumed that a deeply penetrating arrow on this new map would yield the exact same result it did in Western Europe, a rapid political and military collapse.
I can't help but picture someone stretching a massive rubber band across a giant wooden table.
Okay, I like that visual.
You pull it back, and you stretch it out, and that represents these 3 army groups pushing thousands of miles into Russia. But at some point, the further you stretch that rubber band across this incredibly massive territory, the tension has to break.
It's gonna snap.
It's physically impossible to stretch it forever. It feels like these tidy maps gave Halder and his planners this fatal false sense of security, like they were planning an invasion based on a mathematical formula that just didn't account for the brutal friction of reality.
That friction is exactly what would soon shatter all their timetables. And one of the most immediate sources of that friction wasn't even just the vast distances or the terrain. It was what the Soviets were building in secret, far from the eyes of German intelligence.
The machines.
Right. As we look at the next set of visual sources in our stack, we move away from the sweeping maps of the planners directly into the gritty, heavy metal reality of the tools the soldiers would actually use.
Yeah, we have a whole set of highly detailed vehicle schematics here, and they tell a story of an absolutely massive, almost unbelievable intelligence failure.
A total blind spot.
First, I'm looking at the schematics for the older Soviet tank models, the T-26 and the BT-7 fast tank, and they look exactly like what you picture when you think of early, almost outdated interwar tanks.
Very classical shapes.
The T-26 is very boxy. It has these flat, 90-degree vertical armor plates that look like they are held together with thick rivets, and a relatively small, thin gun barrel on top. The BT-7 has similar flat-sided armor and these very large, prominent road wheels.
They don't look particularly tough.
No, they look fragile. They look like armored tin cans, to be honest.
Well, those schematics represent the tanks the Germans generally expected to face. German intelligence had a relatively accurate picture of these older models.
They knew about them.
Yeah, they were lightly armored, designed primarily for infantry support or rapid cavalry-style exploitation behind enemy lines. They were definitely not designed to survive a heavy slugging match with dedicated anti-tank guns.
Like the German guns.
Right. A standard German 37mm anti-tank gun could punch right through the flat, vertical armor of a T-26 without much trouble at all.
But then the shock came.
The shock came when the Germans crossed the border and encountered what is on the next page of our sources.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now, and the visual difference is staggering. I'm looking at the blueprints for 2 entirely new machines, the T-34 medium tank and the KV heavy tank.
Completely different animals.
The T-34 doesn't have those boxy vertical walls at all. The front armor, the sides, the turret, everything is heavily angled and sloped. It looks sleek, predatory, almost futuristic compared to the T-26.
It looks fast even standing still.
Exactly. And then there is the KV tank. The schematic for this machine is just pure intimidation. It has this hulking, massive, squared-off turret, incredibly thick tracks, and a massive gun. It literally looks like a moving concrete bunker.
What you are looking at with the T-34 and the KV represents one of the greatest technological intelligence failures of the 20th century. The Germans had virtually no idea these tanks existed in any significant numbers.
They were totally blind to it.
Completely.
Right.
Let's delve into the mechanics of why that matters, specifically looking at the sloped armor of the T-34. Because that sloping is not an aesthetic choice by a designer just trying to make the tank look cool or fast.
It's functional.
It is a massive leap forward in metallurgical and mechanical engineering.
Okay, so break that down for us. How exactly does sloped armor change the physics of an actual tank battle?
It really just comes down to geometry and the physics of deflection. Imagine an armor plate that is 45 millimeters thick. If that plate is standing straight up, perfectly vertical, an incoming enemy shell only has to punch through exactly 45 millimeters of steel to enter the tank.
Makes sense. Straight line through.
But if you take that exact same 45 millimeter plate and you tilt it back at a 60-degree angle, The horizontal path that a shell traveling parallel to the ground has to take through the steel is suddenly much, much longer.
Oh, I see. Because it's traveling at a diagonal through the metal.
Exactly. Because of the angle, the line of sight thickness effectively doubles to roughly 90 millimeters. You have doubled your armor protection without adding a single pound of extra steel to the tank, which keeps it incredibly fast and mobile.
Wow, that is incredibly clever. You get twice the armor for the same weight.
It is, but the geometry is really only half the benefit. The other half is deflection. When a high-velocity anti-tank round strikes a sharply angled surface, the kinetic energy of the shell doesn't just push straight in.
It bounces.
A large portion of that energy wants to follow the path of least resistance. The shape of the T-34 literally caused standard German anti-tank shells to ricochet harmlessly off into the air.
Just bouncing right off.
And as for the KV tank, it didn't even need sloped armor. Its frontal armor was up to 75 millimeters thick, sometimes even 90 millimeters of solid steel.
So, put us on the ground for a second. You have to imagine you are a German anti-tank crew on day 3 of the invasion. You've been told by your commanders that the Soviets are racially inferior, that their technology is entirely backward, and that their army is going to just shatter at the first blow.
You're supremely confident.
Right. And you are sitting in a ditch with your standard 37mm anti-tank gun, the one affectionately nicknamed the door knocker by your crew because it worked perfectly well knocking on French tanks a year ago.
It did its job in France.
Exactly. And suddenly the tree line shakes and this massive KV tank rolls out. You line up a perfect shot right in the center of its chest and you fire. And you just watch your shell spark and bounce off that thick armor like a pebble off a brick wall.
Like it was nothing.
The tank doesn't even slow down. The psychological shock of that moment, it must have been absolutely paralyzing for those crews.
Oh, it induced genuine widespread panic among frontline units. There are countless field reports from the opening weeks where German infantry and anti-tank units realized they possess absolutely no weapons capable of penetrating the frontal armor of these new Soviet beasts.
Nothing they could do.
They were forced to resort to desperate measures. They had to call in heavy divisional artillery to fire over open sights, or, and this is crazy, bring up 88mm anti-aircraft guns.
The ones used to shoot down planes.
Right, which were designed to shoot down bombers and use them just to stop a single KV tank. Or, horrifically, infantry had to run up to the tanks in these suicidal close-quarters attacks, trying to jam explosive charges into the treads or the engine decks.
Unbelievable.
The German army was suddenly facing a technologically superior weapon they didn't even know existed.
Wait, hold on. This brings up a massive contradiction in our sources.
Okay, what do you see?
If the Soviets secretly possessed thousands of these incredible futuristic T-34s with genius sloped armor and these massive impenetrable KV tanks that literally bounced German shells, how are they losing?
Yes.
I mean, I'm looking ahead at the operational maps from July, August, and September, and the Germans are advancing hundreds of miles. They are trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. That doesn't make any logical sense. If your tanks are invincible, why is your army collapsing so fast?
That is the pivotal question of 1941. And the answer really cuts to the very heart of what makes a military force effective. A tank, no matter how heavily armored or brilliantly designed it is ultimately just a piece of steel.
Right, it doesn't fight by itself.
Exactly. Its effectiveness is entirely dependent on the infrastructure, the doctrine, and the training of the humans operating it. At the exact moment the Germans invaded, the Soviet military was in the throes of a massive, chaotic reorganization. Stalin's brutal purges in the late 1930s had absolutely decimated the officer corps.
He killed his own generals.
He executed or imprisoned thousands of his most experienced commanders.
So the people who actually knew how to coordinate large-scale tank warfare were just gone. And they were replaced by junior officers who were probably terrified to make a decision without explicit orders from Moscow.
Precisely. They were paralyzed by fear of making a mistake. And on top of that, the logistical network was a total disaster. Many of these new T-34s and KVs were rolling right off the assembly lines and being sent directly to units without adequate spare parts, recovery vehicles, or even basic maintenance tools.
So they break down and stay broken.
Yes. Furthermore, and this is a crucial detail often overlooked, very few Soviet tanks in 1941 were equipped with radios.
Wait, really? No radios?
Only the platoon commander's tank might have a radio. The rest of the tanks in the unit had to communicate using flag signals.
Flag signals. Inside a closed steel box in the middle of a chaotic, smoke-filled battlefield.
Sticking flags out the hatch, yes.
That's like, okay, imagine you have the absolute latest, most powerful smartphone on the market. It's got the fastest processor, a massive battery, and a camera that can see in the dark. It is technologically vastly superior to whatever your opponent has.
Right, top of the line.
But you live in an area with zero cell towers, no Wi-Fi, and you don't even have the charging cable. The raw internal power of the phone means absolutely nothing if you don't have the network to support it.
That's a great way to think about it.
The raw power of a T-34 means nothing if you don't have the radios to coordinate with the tank next to you, the supply trucks to bring you diesel, and the officers who understand actual tactical maneuvers.
The smartphone analogy is incredibly apt. The blueprints in our sources prove the Soviets had the raw technological hardware, but the maps showing the initial German victories prove that they completely lacked the network to utilize them.
They just couldn't deploy them effectively.
Right. A German panzer division wasn't just tanks. It was a tightly integrated symphony of tanks, motorized infantry, self-propelled artillery, and close air support, all constantly communicating via radio.
A combined arms network.
Exactly. So when a group of untrained Soviet tanks, unable to talk to each other, ran into a German panzer division, the Germans simply outmaneuvered them. They flanked them, isolated them, and destroyed them. Countless T-34s and KVs were lost in those opening weeks, not to enemy fire, but simply because they broke down, ran out of gas, and had to be abandoned in ditches by their exhausted crews.
Wow. And because the Soviets couldn't effectively wield this incredible technology, Halder's rubber band of German army groups was allowed to stretch incredibly deep into Russian territory. Which leads us to the next set of visual evidence, focusing on the myth and the stark reality of the Blitzkrieg.
Right, the encirclements.
Yeah, I am looking at a series of progression maps from late June through September, and the tactical victories depicted here are just astonishing.
The maps outline a series of massive encirclement battles that are almost without precedent in military history. If you look at the progression, what stands out immediately are the dark, shaded pockets drawn around major cities.
Yeah, those big dark circles.
We see the Minsk pocket in late June, the Smolensk pocket in July, and the absolutely colossal Kiev pocket in September.
These pockets on the map look like giant dark nets that have just been thrown over massive portions of the Soviet Union. The German arrows wrap entirely around whole Soviet armies, cutting them off from supply and any hope of retreat.
Complete isolation.
And the scale of the human tragedy represented by those dark shaded areas is really hard to fathom. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers trapped, starved, bombarded, and ultimately destroyed or captured in each of these pockets. On paper, on these maps, the concept of blitzkrieg looks flawless. It looks like this unstoppable machine executing surgical strikes.
And that is the exact myth that the Nazi propaganda ministry broadcast to the terrified world.
They sold it well.
They absolutely did. The carefully curated newsreels showed unstoppable armored spearheads, endless columns of tanks carving up the map at will, driven by a modern mechanized Uber army. But if we look past the clean lines of the maps and examine the raw, unfiltered battlefield photography in our source stack, the true, deeply flawed reality of the German army is completely exposed.
Yeah, the photographs from the front lines are a brutal reality check. The first one shows German infantry running heavily armed through a burning Russian village. The smoke is thick and black, the timber houses are engulfed in flames, and the soldiers look totally exhausted.
It's a gritty, dirty fight.
Another photo shows German troops engaged in intense firefights in a heavily wooded area, literally crawling on their stomachs through the dirt. There's nothing surgical about it. It looks chaotic and primitive. But there is one photograph here that just stopped me in my tracks. It completely shatters the entire image of the highly advanced, mechanized German war machine.
It is arguably one of the most important photographs in understanding the failure of Operation Barbarossa.
When I hear the word blitzkrieg, I immediately picture rumbling engines, steel treads, tanks, and half-tracks pouring over the horizon in a cloud of exhaust. But the photograph I'm looking at shows a massive German artillery and supply column rushing toward the front lines, and it is entirely drawn by horses.
Pure 19th century transport.
There are dozens of horses pulling heavy wooden wagons, ammunition limbers, and large artillery pieces, kicking up immense clouds of dust as soldiers march alongside them on foot. Honestly, if you took away the German helmets, this looks like a photograph from the American Civil War or the Napoleonic Wars. It does not look like a 20th century mechanized invasion.
That photograph reveals the carefully guarded secret of the Wehrmacht. It was a fundamentally divided force.
Two different armies, basically.
Exactly. Yes, they had incredibly fast, highly capable mechanized panzer and motorized infantry divisions at the very tip of the spear, the fast-moving arrows on the map. But those mechanized units made up only a small fraction of the entire army.
Just the tip.
The vast, overwhelming majority of the German infantry, the hundreds of thousands of men who actually had to march into those burning villages and clear out those encircled pockets, and almost the entirety of the army's logistical supply tail relied entirely on horse-drawn transport. The German army invaded the Soviet Union with roughly 750,000 horses.
750,000 horses. That is just mind-blowing. Let's unpack the math on that because it sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It absolutely was.
It's like entering a world-class Olympic sprinter into a 100-mile cross-country marathon, but forcing them to be tethered to a pack mule.
That's a brilliant way to picture it.
The sprinter, who represents the mechanized panzer divisions, can shoot off the starting line and run incredibly fast for the first few miles. They can penetrate deep into enemy territory, but eventually the sprinter is going to run out of breath, or in the tank's case, fuel and ammunition.
They have to stop.
Right, and they have no choice but to stop, sit down in the dirt, and wait for the slow-moving mule carrying their food, water, and bullets to slowly walk up and catch them.
The math of relying on horses for a deep penetration invasion is devastating. And your analogy highlights the inherent tension in the German doctrine. A horse requires approximately 20 pounds of fodder-sow oats and hay every single day just to survive the heavy labor of pulling a wagon.
20 pounds every day.
When you have 750,000 horses, that means the German supply chain has to move roughly 15 million pounds of horse feed to the front lines every single day. And that's before they can move a single bullet, a single artillery shell, or a single drop of diesel for the tanks.
15 million pounds of feed. That is absurd. The horses are essentially eating the logistical capacity of the army before the soldiers even get supplied.
Exactly. The wagons carrying the fire are pulled by horses who eat the fodder they are carrying while they walk.
So it's eating into its own payload?
Exactly. It's a law of diminishing returns that strictly limits how far an army can travel from its railheads. As those mechanized arrows on the map stretched deeper and deeper into the Soviet Union, hundreds of miles ahead of the railways, the horse-drawn supply tail simply couldn't keep up.
They were just left in the dust.
The horses were driven to exhaustion under the blazing summer heat, pulling heavy loads over unpaved, dusty, rutted roads. Hundreds of thousands of horses died of exhaustion, starvation, and disease. This left the German infantry stranded and forced the panzer spearheads to constantly pause to wait for fuel and ammunition.
So the German army was literally tearing its own muscles apart by moving so fast. Their supply lines were stretching, fraying, and becoming incredibly vulnerable. And here is the critical pivot.
A turning point.
While the German advance periodically had to stop and sit in the dust to let those exhausted horses and foot soldiers catch up to the tanks, they were giving the Soviet Union the one and only thing Stalin desperately needed: time. Because the next set of visual sources shows us exactly what the Soviets did with those precious weeks.
We are shifting our focus now from the military battlefield to the Soviet home front. And the imagery provided in our stack is some of the most powerful and sobering of the entire collection. What we are looking at is the visual documentation of a society transitioning from a purely military conflict into absolute, unmitigated, total war.
The photos here are deeply moving, and before we examine the propaganda elements, I want to be incredibly clear with you, the listener. We are about to discuss highly charged political and ideological imagery from both the Soviet and Nazi regimes.
Unnecessary content.
Right. We are analyzing these materials strictly as historical artifacts of psychological warfare and mobilization. We are not endorsing the brutal ideologies or the regimes that produce them, but to understand the war, we have to understand how the people were manipulated and mobilized.
A vital clarification, because the mobilization we see in these images was born of sheer existential desperation.
Let's look at the first photograph in this section. It's taken inside a Soviet factory, and the conditions look horrific. It's clearly freezing in there. You can almost see the breath in the air. The lighting is poor. And standing there at these massive, heavy industrial metal lathes are women.
Civilians stepping up.
They are wrapped in heavy coats, thick shawls, and headscarves, machining massive, heavy artillery shells. The sheer physical grit required to stand for a 14-hour shift, lifting heavy steel casings, operating dangerous machinery in a freezing factory on starvation rations, it's palpable. They're literally manufacturing the replacements for the massive losses we just saw encircled on the maps.
What is so fascinating about this image is that it highlights a complete societal mobilization that the German planners fundamentally failed to anticipate.
I didn't see it coming at all.
Not even a little. Halder and the High Command, looking at their neat maps back in Berlin, were counting on the political collapse of the Soviet regime once the initial military defeats occurred. They genuinely believed the population, brutalized by years of Stalin's terror and starvation, would welcome the Germans as liberators, or at least turn on their own government.
But the opposite happened.
Right. Instead, fueled by the staggering brutality of the German invasion and the realization that the Nazis intended a war of racial annihilation, the entire Soviet society mobilized every man, woman, and child for sheer survival.
We see that physical mobilization perfectly in the next photograph. It shows an endless line of civilians. And when you look closely at the faces, it's almost entirely women, the elderly, and young teenagers.
Anyone who could hold a shovel.
Exactly. And they are spread out over this seemingly endless landscape, digging a massive, deep anti-tank trench. They are doing it entirely with hand tools, shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows. The trench stretches for miles over the horizon, just trying to comprehend the sheer volume of earth being moved by civilian hands, trying to physically alter the geography of the earth to stop German panzers, is astonishing.
You are looking at the construction of the Mozhaisk defense line outside Moscow. Roughly 250,000 civilians, mostly women, mobilized to dig over 3 million cubic meters of earth.
3 million with shovels.
This is the physical manifestation of total war. The German army wasn't just fighting the Soviet military anymore, which they were successfully destroying in those large pockets. They were now fighting the geography itself. And they were fighting the absolute desperate willpower of an entire population that realized this was a fight to the death.
That uncompromising desperation is mirrored in the propaganda posters in our stack, too. One poster utilizes that classic, bold, constructivist aesthetic. It features stark red and black colors, with bold Cyrillic letters demanding, "Our cause is just! The enemy will be defeated! Victory will be ours!"
Very iconic imagery.
It's placed right next to a column of grimly determined, idealized Soviet troops marching forward. Another incredibly striking poster simply commands, "Defend Moscow." It features a line of heavily shadowed, grim-faced soldiers alongside civilians, holding rifles with fixed bayonets with the silhouette of the Kremlin looming in the background. It is an uncompromising demand for ultimate sacrifice.
And we also see the psychological and almost spiritual mobilization of the military itself in these sources. There is a deeply poignant photograph of a unit of Soviet soldiers kneeling in a clearing in a dark forest.
I'm looking at that one right now.
They are gathered around a heavy, star-emblazoned regimental flag. And one by one, the soldiers are leaning forward to physically kiss the fabric of the flag, taking a solemn oath. It is an image of profound, fatalistic dedication. It signals that these men fully expect to die in the coming battles, but they are accepting that fate for the defense of the motherland.
I look at this massive civilian and societal response, and it reminds me of someone kicking a massive beehive.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
The initial German attack was brutal. They swung a bat and completely smashed the outer defenses of the hive. The maps show that clearly. But instead of the hive collapsing, giving up, and dying, the attack triggered a total, instinctive, and utterly ruthless mobilization. Every single bee in that hive instantly shifted its purpose from whatever it was doing before to protecting the queen, or in this case, Moscow and the state, and swarmed the attacker.
Complete swarm defense.
How did the German planners miss this? Did they just completely fail to account for this level of civilian willpower?
They absolutely failed to account for it. And it was a massive blind spot, born of sheer ideological arrogance. The Nazi racial ideology blinded them to reality. They assumed the Soviet structure was a rotten edifice that would collapse with one kick to the door.
Just kick it in and the whole house fall.
Right. That was Hitler's actual quote. They could measure the number of tanks the Soviets had. They could measure the miles of railway track. But they possessed no metric, no slide rule, and no symbol on their operational maps to measure the resilience and the capacity for suffering of the Soviet citizen.
And as those Soviet civilians dug their trenches by hand and the factory workers churned out replacement tanks, they bought crucial weeks of time. They bled the German momentum just enough to push the timeline of the war into the autumn.
And then the weather changed everything.
Exactly. That's when the terrain itself became an active combatant, and the entire visual landscape of the war changed completely.
We are entering the period known as the Rasputitsa. It translates roughly to the time without roads or the mud season. It is a meteorological and geographical phenomenon that occurs in Eastern Europe and Russia in the autumn when heavy rains fall on the unpaved terrain and again in the spring when the heavy winter snows melt.
It's infamous.
The visual evidence we have of this period in our sources is almost hard to believe if you haven't seen it.
These photographs are incredible, and honestly, they look miserable. We have an image of what is supposed to be a main logistical supply route, but it is just a churning, bottomless ocean of thick, black, viscous mud.
It doesn't even look like water and dirt.
No, it doesn't even look like dirt. It looks like wet cement. And stuck right in the middle of it are German supply trucks, command cars, and horse-drawn wagons sunk literally up to their axles. The tires are completely swallowed by the earth.
To understand why this mud is so uniquely devastating, you have to understand the soil of the region. Much of Ukraine and Western Russia is covered in Chernozem, or black earth. It is incredibly fertile agricultural soil, but it has a very high clay content.
Oh, clay. That explains it.
Right. When the autumn rains hit this soil, because there is no paved highway network to speak of, the water doesn't drain. The clay absorbs it and turns into a thick, adhesive gel.
So it's not just slippery, it physically grabs onto anything that touches it.
Exactly. It creates an incredible suction effect. If we connect this back to our earlier discussion about the German logistical tail, this is where the crisis becomes acute terminal failure.
The horses and the mules.
The mechanized advantage of the German panzer divisions was instantly neutralized by the weather. The fast-moving, decisive arrows on General Halder's clean operational maps simply dissolved into these static, unmoving bogs. A tank that could travel 30 miles an hour on a paved road is now burning massive amounts of its limited fuel just trying to move 100 yards through waist-deep sludge, often burning out his transmission in the process.
There is another photo here showing German soldiers physically struggling to pull their equipment through the sludge. You can see the absolute exhaustion in their posture. They are leaning forward at a 45-degree angle, covered head to toe in mud, trying to drag a heavy wooden wagon.
Brute force.
It looks like trying to run a marathon in a swamp while wearing concrete shoes. And speaking of shoes, I've read that the German marching boots had metal hobnails on the bottom for durability, which actually acted like suction cups in the specific clay, literally sucking the boots right off the soldiers' feet with every step.
Unbelievable.
The amount of caloric energy burned just moving 10 feet must have been astronomical.
The psychological toll of this phenomenon on an advancing army is profound. For months, these German soldiers had been part of a seemingly invincible force. They had advanced at lightning speed, covering dozens of miles a day, fueled by victory and momentum.
And now they're stuck in the mud.
Suddenly, they are reduced to a crawling, exhausting halt. They are filthy, they are freezing in the autumn rain, their supply lines are hopelessly mired in the mud hundreds of miles behind them, and they are acutely aware that the Russian winter is rapidly approaching. The psychological momentum was entirely broken. They were trapped.
We even have a photo of a desperate tactical adaptation to this mud. There is an image of a massive German 88mm anti-aircraft gun. Usually these are pointed high into the sky to shoot down bombers, but in this photo, it is deployed completely flat in a muddy field, aiming horizontally.
That image speaks volumes about the breakdown of the German tactical system. Because their actual tanks and mobile anti-tank units were stuck in the mud or had broken down, they had to drag these massive, heavy anti-aircraft guns to the front lines just to have a chance at stopping the Soviet tanks.
Because the Soviet tanks could still move.
The Soviet T-34s, with their wider tracks, had lower ground pressure and could navigate the mud slightly better than the narrow-tracked German Panzers. It was a sign of extreme desperation for the Germans. The entire offensive was bogged down.
I just have to ask, how could a military staff as highly regarded as the German High Command, these guys with their slide rules and meticulous timetables, plan the invasion of the largest country on Earth and seemingly not factor in the seasonal mud?
It sounds crazy in hindsight.
It's not like the Rasputitsa was a secret. Napoleon wrote about it. Did they just look at their maps and assume they'd win the whole war before it rained?
In a word, yes. The entire premise of Operation Barbarossa was predicated on a swift, decisive victory before the autumn rains began. They gambled the survival of their entire army on a perfect, uninterrupted timeline.
A huge gamble.
They assumed the Soviet state would collapse in 8 to 10 weeks. When that timeline failed, because of the vast distances, the unforeseen Soviet reserves, and the fierce civilian resistance, the German army was caught completely unprepared for the geographical and meteorological reality of Russia. They literally didn't issue winter clothing because they assumed they would be victorious and sitting in warm barracks by October.
And as bad as the mud was, it was only a temporary barrier. because eventually the temperature dropped, the rain turned to snow, and the mud froze solid like concrete.
Which let them move again.
Vehicles could finally move again, but as we look at the final set of images in our stack, the freezing temperatures brought a far deadlier reality and an enemy that had completely revitalized itself for the Winter War.
We begin this final phase by looking at the operational maps, showing late November and early December of 1941. The ground has frozen, and the German army launches one final, desperate, all-out lunge toward Moscow, codenamed Operation Typhoon.
The last push?
The maps show these intense, aggressive red arrows closing in on the Soviet capital, attempting a massive pincer movement to encircle the city from the north and south. The arrows get agonizingly close. Some German reconnaissance units get close enough to see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars.
They were right there. But then, the maps show a massive explosive eruption of Soviet counterattacks starting in early December and pushing violently outward through the winter into April 1942.
A massive reversal.
The arrows completely reverse direction. Heavy blue arrows smash into the overextended German lines. The German front is pushed back, heavily fractured, and on the verge of total collapse. But the maps only tell part of the story. It's the photographs from this winter that are truly iconic and explain how this reversal happened.
One of the most critical visual documents of the entire war, and frankly a masterclass in psychological warfare, is the photograph of the November 7th military parade in Red Square.
It's an amazing image. The snow is falling heavily. In the background, you see the iconic shape of Lenin's mausoleum and the Kremlin walls. And marching past it, right through the snow, are dense columns of Soviet troops.
Defiant.
They are wrapped in heavy winter coats, carrying rifles with fixed bayonets. We also have a photo of those Katyusha rocket launchers lined up perfectly in the square. This parade was held to commemorate the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, but it was held while the German army was literally at the gates of the city, just a few dozen miles away.
The psychological power of this single photograph cannot be overstated. By holding this parade in the open, under immediate threat of German artillery and airstrikes, Stalin was visually proving to his population, to his exhausted army, and to the listening world that the Soviet leadership had not fled.
They were staying to fight.
They were not broken.
Yeah.
And remarkably, the troops seen marching in this photograph did not return to barracks. They marched straight out of Red Square and directly to the freezing front lines just outside the city. It is the ultimate visual proof of a nation whose back is against the wall, choosing absolute defiance over surrender.
And when those troops hit the front lines, the visual condition of the two armies was a stark, horrifying contrast. Our sources show a series of photographs of the Soviet counteroffensive. We see T-34 tanks no longer in summer green, but painted in stark, ghost-white winter camouflage, speeding seemingly effortlessly across the deep snow.
Adapted to the environment.
You see Soviet troops in thick, padded white winter gear, looking highly mobile, warm, and lethal. We have an action photo of those Katyusha rocket launchers, which the terrified Germans called Stalin's organs because of the shrieking sound they made, firing massive, fiery salvos of rockets into the freezing gray sky. It looks like an army that has completely recovered its industrial and military strength.
This is where the extreme winter conditions completely flip the technological advantage, and it comes down to physics and preparation. We talked about the T-34's sloped armor earlier, but now its wide tracks became its greatest asset.
Because of the snow.
The wide tracks distributed the tank's 30-ton weight over a larger surface area, giving it very low ground pressure. This allowed the T-34 to literally glide over deep snow drifts, much like a person wearing snowshoes. The standard German Panzer III and 4V tanks had narrow tracks with high ground pressure, meaning they would instantly dig in, sink into the snowdrifts, and get stuck.
It wasn't just the tracks, right? It was everything.
Everything. The Soviet equipment was designed natively for this brutal environment. The T-34 used a diesel engine, which is much harder to freeze than the gasoline engines used by the Germans. Furthermore, the German equipment was literally freezing solid.
Just icing over.
At 30 or 40 degrees below zero, the synthetic oil in the German tank engines turned to tar. They had to light fires under the engines just to start them.
Light fires under their own tanks.
Yes. The lubricating oil in their machine guns froze, causing them to jam. The optical sights on their anti-tank guns frosted over completely. They were paralyzed.
There is one photo here that is just stunning in its juxtaposition of eras. It shows Soviet cavalry, literally men on horseback, wearing heavy capes with sabers drawn, charging at full speed through deep snowdrifts. In a war that has been defined by advanced machines, aircraft, and tanks, you have men on horseback making a decisive tactical impact.
It is a profound irony of the Eastern Front. But in deep snow, where complex internal combustion engines freeze and mechanized transport utterly fails, a horse can still move.
Nature beats the machine.
The Soviet cavalry, operating in specialized corps, was highly effective in this deep winter environment. While the German motorized units were hopelessly pinned to the few cleared roads, the Soviet cavalry could infiltrate through the frozen, snow-filled forests to flank the German positions, cut their fragile supply lines, and vanish back into the trees.
Now contrast those images of Soviet mobility and winter preparation with the photographs of the German army during this counteroffensive. The visual of ruin is absolute. We have a photo of an abandoned German artillery piece. It is completely buried in a massive snowdrift, utterly useless, abandoned by its crew, and lying in the snow next to it is the frozen, rigid body of a German soldier wearing a summer uniform lightly covered in snow.
It is the visual culmination of Halder's flawed map. The German army at the gates of Moscow was a broken instrument.
It reminds me of a deep-sea diver who is trying to reach a legendary shipwreck. The diver has gone deeper and deeper into the dark, ignoring all the warning gauges on his suit, obsessed with the prize.
Overextending himself.
He finally touches the gold, but right at that exact moment, his oxygen tank runs completely empty. He can see the prize, he can touch it, but he is physically incapable of taking it, and the pressure of the environment he ignored is now crushing him. Now he's just fighting a desperate, losing battle to survive the freezing environment he foolishly thought he could conquer.
That is a highly accurate assessment of what military theorists call operational culmination. The German army had extended beyond its logistical, physical, and psychological limits. The environment, the distance, and the enemy had drained them of all offensive capacity.
The final image in our source stack perfectly encapsulates the end of this massive, bloody phase of the war. It is a Soviet propaganda cartoon published during the winter counteroffensive.
A really striking one, too.
It shows a caricature of Adolf Hitler, no longer the fanatical, shouting warlord from the first photograph, but looking terrified, sweaty, and small. He is being physically crushed by giant, heavy metal pincers. The pincers are labeled with red Soviet stars and represent the massive defense of Moscow closing in on him. It is a visceral, taunting image that boldly declares to the world that the myth of German invincibility is finally dead in the snows of Russia.
And it was. Operation Barbarossa failed to destroy the Soviet Union. It unleashed a war of annihilation that would rage for 3 more horrific years, ending only in the ruins of Berlin, but the assumption of a quick, easy victory was buried forever outside Moscow.
Let's step back from the freezing trenches for a second and look at the incredible journey we've just taken through this stack of visual evidence.
It's been quite a journey.
We started in the pristine, hubristic war rooms with clean operational maps and men believing they could conquer a continent on a perfect timetable. We saw the startling technological mismatch in the tank schematics and explored the physics of sloped armor.
Bouncing those shells right off.
We looked past the newsreel myth of the mechanized blitzkrieg to uncover the logistical nightmare of an army entirely reliant on millions of pounds of horse fodder. We witnessed the incredible, agonizing societal mobilization of Soviet civilians digging trenches by hand.
In the mud.
We sank into the axle-deep viscous clay of the Rasputitsa mud. And finally, we ended in the brutal, freezing counterblow outside Moscow, where men on horseback and winter camouflage tanks broke the German momentum.
The immense value of looking directly at these primary visual sources, these raw photographs, maps, and blueprints from Glantz's work, is that they force us to confront the friction of war.
The real human cost.
Exactly. A clean historical summary often glosses over the mud, the starving horses, the freezing factory workers, and the raw exhaustion etched onto a soldier's face. By analyzing these images and understanding the mechanics behind them, we comprehend not just what happened, but exactly how the unforgiving realities of geography, weather, and logistics dictated the fate of millions of people.
It completely changes how you visualize history. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you step away from this deep dive. When we look at modern conflicts unfolding even today, we still obsess over the technology.
Oh, always. We love the shiny new machines.
We debate the specs of a new fighter jet, the payload of a drone, or we stare at the neat, clean, tactical maps shown on the evening news. But the raw, gritty photographs of 1941 ask us a really chilling question. Does all the advanced technology and brilliant tactical planning in the world actually matter if you fundamentally underestimate the geography, the weather, and the sheer, desperate, unyielding willpower of the people you are invading?
It is the ultimate cautionary question that every military planner in every era must eventually face.
Thank you for joining us on this intense visual journey today. We look forward to exploring another stack of sources with you and uncovering more hidden realities on our next deep dive.